This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, we are on the last module of this, and I have to say you guys have been great. I have appreciated you sticking with me through all this. Micah and I had a little conversation yesterday afternoon. Micah, did you talk to them about what your thoughts were about today? If you're talking, I can't hear you. Hold on.
I just was kind of whispering up under, but I'll share with them now. I talked to Barbara yesterday about when I saw that we were going to be talking about scenarios. I asked if we could share real life situations that we have dealt with in the cottage that we struggled with or weren't 100% sure about, just to get some guidance, and that may help us think through future kids that we may have.
And I said that I would love that because I have to use all of my examples and I get sick of talking about them. So I'd be very happy to have you guys bring anything to the table that you're dealing with.
Okay.
Including some of the stuff that Micah talked to me about yesterday afternoon. So, which I admit, some of the stuff she talked to me about yesterday was news to me. So just when you thought you couldn't learn any more, you can. So. Okay, we're going to talk about Module D, which really is the role of the caregiver in treatment. Now, what I have to say is that when this training was originally devised, it was written for foster parents, not for people like you. And foster parents, at the point that I wrote the training for family services, wanted nothing to do with the kids' treatment. And running Circle of Friends is a perfect example that they usually just call and say, see the kid in school and don't involve me with this. But what we really found over time is that really, it's like I think I said to you guys last week, the therapist is with these kids maybe an hour a week, maybe 2 if you're lucky, or maybe seeing them, maybe in Madison, Alexa sees them peripherally in the halls. But I know that for most children, they see their therapist 1 hour a week, and the rest of the time is really on you. So I'm not asking you to become therapists. I guess what I'm asking is that you just become aware of the signs that they're giving you so that you can react accordingly. And the therapists are trained in this stuff. I know you guys are not, but some of this stuff is just right in front of you. And some of this stuff they are so blatant about when they're trying to tell you that I think they sometimes look at their childcare workers or foster parents and think, oh, what is wrong with you that you cannot figure out what I'm trying to tell you? So, so we're gonna go over a little of that. Let me share my screen. Before we do anything, is there anything from last week that you guys need to talk about?
No, ma'am, I don't think so.
Okay. All right. I'm going to just kind of recap real quick about what we've done so far. Module A, we talked about the difference between normal and abnormal behavior. And we kind of talked about the fact that kids have some sexual behaviors almost from the time they're born. It doesn't make them bad or odd. It's just the way God made our bodies. And all kids are going to start to explore a little bit in different ways, depending on their age, depending on what they do. All kids do something. And that's always been that way, and it's always going to be that way. But kids who have had some kind of sexual misappropriation of their bodies can have a very distorted sense of their sexuality. So, and Mike and I kind of touched on this yesterday afternoon. Your job as caregivers isn't to decide if what their choices are right, wrong, or indifferent. Your job is to just sort of guide them through a healthy sense of who they are sexually, because kids who have been molested, especially incest kids, and I know we talked a little bit about incest, is so much harder to deal with than the other forms of sexual trauma, that many kids who have grown up in incest families don't know that this isn't the way the world works. I'll tell you when they figure it out. They figure it out when they get to school, but some of them don't figure it out until they are teenagers. And the reason for that is that in the typical incest family, they are isolated. They are told not to tell anybody about what goes on in the home. They are often told that this is God's work, that this is what the Bible is telling me to how I should behave towards you as the father. It's my job to teach you something about sex. So kids can get extremely confused and they don't have any idea that what has happened to them is not what should be happening to them. So our job as caregivers is always to just kind of keep re-educating them as to what is healthy. I don't know, I can't see the table that good, so I don't know if Angela is there today. But I'm sorry?
She's not.
Okay, yeah, well, the reason I'm referencing her is that I think it was the very first week, Angela reminded me that she was on the main campus when this little boy named Micah was brought in. And he was one of the youngest kids to ever be admitted to the children's home. He was 5. And he had been admitted because he had gone through some pretty severe incestuous sexual behaviors from his parents from the time that he was a little tiny baby. And he had absolutely no idea what mothers and fathers were supposed to do. And Angela reminded me that she had been in the cottage when all this was going on. And it was a very odd type of thing trying to deal with Micah because he was so little and he was so cute, if you will. That the child care staff were continually there, their mouths hanging open continually from trying to deal with him because he knew a lot about sex and he didn't know that he wasn't supposed to know about it. So he talked about it all the time. And it was very hard for the child care staff to kind of step back and say, oh God, this feels so icky, and trying to help him. So again, your job is not to make a judgment about what kind of sexual beings people want to be. Your job is to just try to help them to go to some healthy place with that. And that's a lot of what we do. That's why we are teachers in the sense. I think I said what I had, Danielle Collette was Micah's therapist, and we bought a series of Berenstein Bear books, and she read him the Berenstein Bears. The only reason we did that was because it was trying to say, Micah, this is what Papa Berenstein does. This is what Mama Berenstein does. This is what the Berenstein children do. And this is what a normal family does. Again, that's kind of where we were with Module A. With Module B, we began to talk about kids who have had sexually reactive or sexually abusive situations are much more apt to display abnormal sexual behaviors. And they really don't always know that their behaviors are abnormal. Certainly, I always have a hard time picking out pictures for these kinds of things. I think in one of the other ones, I found a picture of what appeared to be a child prostitute. So these are not always the most fun PowerPoints to put together. But what we look at with kids who've been exposed to sexuality is that they really don't understand that their behaviors are abnormal, which is why, and I think I was going to show you a couple of real brief human trafficking videos today. It's why kids in group homes who've had sexual trauma background are so vulnerable to human trafficking, because if they run away and they get out on the street and they get picked up by somebody who's very good at figuring out that they are vulnerable, it is very easy to suck them into trafficking, and it's easy to suck them into it really, really fast. So we looked at that in Module B. And in Module C, I think part of the reason that those vignettes in Module C are so difficult is because we wanted them to be difficult. We wanted them to allow you to see that these are not easy things to deal with. And it is okay for you as the caregivers to maybe have that feeling of, oh, this just isn't okay. It's okay that you have your own human emotions about this, and that you can get angry at the people who've done this to these kids. Then you can even get angry at the kids sometimes because you just don't understand some of their behaviors. There's nothing wrong with that as long as you can step back and put on your professional face and be able to respond to kids without having that horrified look on your face. So we talked about the fact that the children aren't bad, but the behavior is certainly considered bad. And that's the part of your brain that you got to break off and say, oh, this doesn't feel very good, but I'm going to try to work with this kid. And we're going to now go into the role of the caregiver in treatment. And again, I'm not asking you guys to get a master's degree. That's not what we're here to do. And when I was training foster parents in this quite a number of years ago, I used to say the same thing to them. Why is it important that you understand what they're trying to tell you? Because they're not always going to come right out and tell you what happened. They're going to give you signs. They're going to show triggers. And if you understand why your kids and your cottagers are behaving the way they are behaving, then you can effectively treat it. You can understand and work in ways that will help the child recover. And you'll gain some support for yourself, because this is not easy work. Before we do anything else, how much exposure or training have you guys had about human trafficking? I know at one point, Micah, we were talking about the fact that you had to do that.
Yeah, I think everybody here had 24 hours of pre-service training. That was pretty gruesome.
Yeah, it is pretty gruesome. How long ago was that?
I did it 2 years ago, so either within the past year or within the past 2 years.
Okay. I know Micah and I have both been involved in some of those human trafficking seminars. The last one got pushed off by the hurricane, so I didn't get on that one. But I think they are pretty brutal. And the reason they're so brutal is that you watch these kids, it's so easy for them to get sucked into this. They have no idea what they're dealing with when they're trying to, when they're approached by a guy who says, you're so pretty, you're so perfect, I want to take care of you, I love you. It's so easy for them to get sucked into that. And the other thing, and you may not have that, because right now you've got all girls, right? You don't have any boys in your cottages right now. One of the things that I saw pretty routinely on the Enterprise campus in the last time I was there, 2015 to 2016, is that traffickers were kind of routinely planting kids in the cottages as recruiters, and they were very good at it. And they were very good at talking to these kids and trying to recruit them and trying to get them to come to the life. And Mike has been on the main campus. I understand you guys have not, but it's a big open campus. And when you get over to the left side of it, it turns into woods. And there's nothing to stop a kid from running out of the cottages, running through those woods, ending up out on that street and being vulnerable to being picked up. And that is the path that they pretty routinely followed. Now, a lot of them were retrieved, but I know of at least one girl that they never got back. And we can only assume what happened to that one girl. So, but the other problem we had that I certainly saw, and Mike, before he passed away, talked about a lot, were the vans that used to circle around. It's a big circle, and they used to circle around there, and it's a rural area, so it's not like there were a lot of police patrolling there. And they used to circle around at night and kind of scope out the girls, and the kids knew they were doing it. So there's a lot of vulnerability for the kids that you work with.
Hey, Barbara, let me see if I'm following. You're saying that in 2015 and 2016, traffickers would place children in the campus to recruit other kids in the cottage to their lifestyle.
Yeah, yeah. It was a fairly common recruiting technique in group homes, because think about the population that you have. They're so vulnerable
Who were
to
the traffickers, though? I mean, they were placed by placing agencies. So who were the traffickers?
the traffic. I know it's hard when I say some of these things and you think, oh God, that can't possibly be true. But what would happen is that kids would be in the life and then they would get out, or their traffickers would allow them to get out and get placed in foster
Okay.
care. And then they would end up placed at the children's home. Now, the reason that it was so blatantly obvious is that you would see these, number one, these were always the kids that ran away on the weekends. And they would run away on Friday and maybe come back on Monday. We had it happen. I'm going to unshare the screen just a minute so I can see you guys a little better. We had it happen not just at FUMSH, but there were several small, very small group homes in Deltona. It was Unity House and Choices, and we had some of these kids in therapy. And I can remember trying to talk to, if you have any exposure to some of those little group homes, they're not people like you. They are very likely very young people. This is their first job in childcare. They're often not much older than the kids in the group homes, and they aren't always as educated as they should be. So we would have these kids, and the other kids would tell the therapist, so-and-so runs away on Friday, she comes back on Sunday and she's, quotes, sexed up. Or she comes back and she's had her nails done and she's had her hair done, or she's got new clothes. And then the chosen girls, it was usually girls, would say, here, if you were in the life, you'd have your nails done, you'd have your hair done. We'd take care of you in the life. Trafficking is a pretty well-oiled operation now. It isn't just a few guys trying to make a hit. It's gang related, and gangs are big business. So it isn't just what it used to be, where a couple of pimps on the street. This is a very well-oiled business machine. So we have that a lot. I can remember trying to talk to the director of Choices, who just got mad and stopped sending their clients to us because they thought we were picking on them. So, what can you do when you see stuff like that? You do the best you can do. You know what? I think I'm going to show you guys just real quick. I was looking at some of them yesterday because I just want to show you how easy it is for this to happen. Just give me a minute to bring it up. We have a whole playlist on our YouTube channel about human trafficking, and they're all hard to watch. But this one is real short. I'm gonna show it to you. It just shows you how quickly this can happen. Even with kids who look like they're reasonably intelligent kids, it's so easy for kids to get sucked into this. This girl has no idea who she's talking to.
Hey, Jessica?
Hey, are you Brian?
Yeah, the studio's just a walk away. Do you want to get going?
You don't really look at your profile picture.
Yeah, that picture's a few years old. But anyway, let's go. Come on.
Sure, yeah.
And we did all this stuff, now you owe me money, now you have to work off the money.
Thank you for joining us. Sex trafficking is an issue we hear about often, but how bad is the problem in
Hold on,
our
I can't get rid of it.
It's not something we're
That happened yesterday.
deciding they are African, but it's definitely lurking online.
The pimps who rope victims into sex trafficking prey on those who are vulnerable.
Sorry about that. Okay, the reason that I use that one is because that girl looks reasonably intelligent, doesn't she? She has no idea who she's talking to. And a lot of times, I know when we sit on the human trafficking workshops and they talk about how easy it is during the pandemic, because kids were home and their parents weren't always paying as much attention as they should have been to who they were getting online with, this happened with a lot of kids because they don't know who they're talking to. And they think they're talking to a 14-year-old boy or a 15-year-old boy, and they're not at all. So I use that one a lot in training because at least you can watch it. Some of them are so hard to watch that I fear what happens when I'm doing the training is that the videos are so hard to watch that people just kind of back away from them because some of them are pretty violent. So Micah probably found a few of those when she was training you. It's hard not to. It's hard to find something to teach somebody about the dangers of this without just getting into videos that you can't stand to look at. So let's talk a little bit about a lot of this, when we're talking about sexual predators and kids being nailed as sexual predators, a lot of it has to do with boys, which I understand you don't have on your campus right now. But it also kind of shows the history of how this came about. I think I have another video in here that I was going to show you. Florida has something, I believe it's called the Rogers Rule. Once you get convicted and imprisoned for a sex offense, it can be incredibly hard to get out, even if you are a juvenile. And I believe one of the videos we're going to show you has to do with that. Because in order to be released, you have to have somebody like me or somebody like Micah be willing to go to court and swear that this person is never going to do this again. Now, it's kind of hard to get a professional to say something like that. And there's so much misinformation about kids who do act out sexually, and so much misinformation about the fact that they're going to repeat those offenses, that people like me, people like Micah are not immune to that stuff. So it becomes very hard to get out once you're there, which is why you see some of these people who just linger in jail, where serial killers get out quicker than sex offenders do. And this is, I always feel like I have to say this, This is not Willie. This is a stock photo. But I was doing a CBHA assessment on a Devereaux kid. This probably goes back maybe 10 years. And I found this in his file. He was 6 years old. And it said Willie is considered a sexual predator and can't ever be left alone with younger males, especially younger children, especially males. Now, that is still in Willie's file. If Willie has aged out of the foster care system at this point, it's still going to be in his file. It's going to follow him through his life like a computer virus. And it's very hard to get rid of stuff like this once it gets in there. And there was a period of time that we were kind of cavalierly calling kids sex offenders. And you don't want to throw that around. You don't want to throw it around whether it's a girl or a boy, because at this point in Florida, to be considered a juvenile sex offender, you have to be 13 and older, and you have to have been convicted of a crime. You can't just be accused of something. So if you see something coming in on any of your kids that has stuff like this, you need to be aware that that should not be in the files. And believe me, it's in a lot of files and it shouldn't be there. So we're going to talk a little bit about fact or fiction, and oh, I guess this is where that video is. There are a lot of assumptions about juvenile sex offenders, and most of them are not true. But the reason that they are false assumptions is because people believe them, and false assumptions can be very, very dangerous. And these are the 4 big ones. When I was putting this together and just kind of was Googling some of this, these were the 4 big ones that I found. And these are all false, just so you know. There's an epidemic of juvenile sex offending in our country today. That is not true. There are a lot of kids who've been exposed to sexual improprieties. There are a lot of kids who have been molested as children. But that doesn't translate into becoming a sex offender. The second one is that juvenile sex offenders have more in common with adult sex offenders than other juvenile delinquents. And this is where some of the really bad treatment of juvenile sex offenders comes from, because they are not adults, they are still children. And Florida is Florida. Florida is really bad at trying youth who are under the age of 16 as adults. And when I say I have a really hard time with that, because trying a 12-year-old as or a 14-year-old, as in the case with the girl from the children's home who ran away, both she and that kid, he was 12 and she was 14 when that happened, and they made the decision to try them both as adults. There is no way that a 12-year-old kid can make an adult decision, especially a 12-year-old kid who'd spent half of his life in Baker Act facilities. And Nicole was the same way. She had spent half of her life in residential treatment, in Baker Act facilities, in residential treatment, in foster care. There's no way either one of those kids could make adult decisions. But that seems to be a Florida thing. And I watched the press conference when the district attorney announced that he was going to try them as adults. And he seemed very conflicted about the fact that he was going to try them as adults. And he kept saying, even if they're convicted, I can't sentence them as adults. Well, what did that 12-year-old boy ended up getting sentenced? He's in the highest level of a residential juvenile sex offender or juvenile offense facility, and he's going to be there until he's 18. So, and she hasn't been tried yet because she seemed to think that a jury was going to be kinder to her than a judge, which is probably, again, a big mistake on her part. She's 15 years old.
She's fine.
If somebody said something, I can't hear what you said.
We had somebody come to the door.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. I just didn't want to miss something if you had something to say. The third thing that we look at is without intensive intervention, juvenile sex offenders are going to reoffend. That is the worst one. That is absolutely not true. Kids who commit sex offenses at a young age are at very low risk of recidivism. They don't usually reoffend. If they do reoffend, it's not for that. And intensive residential treatment is the treatment of choice. That, when I moved to Florida, there is, well, it's still there. There's a locked facility in Orlando called the University Behavioral Center, and they had a locked ward for kids who were juvenile sex offenders. In fact, one of our current therapists worked there for a while. And the guy who was in charge of it, his name was Bill something, I just can't remember because he's since passed away, took a very hard line. And this was in the late 90s. In the early 2000s, took a very hard line to the way he was working with these kids. And he was working with them and giving them, it was an adult protocol. And even when I came and learned about it, I was kind of shocked. But again, I think, and I know that I've said this and I can repeat it because now it's on YouTube because I've recorded all this. When I got here in '98, I thought that some of these treatment models had evolved in Florida more than they had, because I had come from a state where the treatment models had evolved over a number of years. So some of this is stuff that I think we're kind of getting away from. But it was here when I got here for sure. Okay, I don't know why this is here because this is not what I'm going to show you, but I'm going to show you a little video and it kind of explains how many states deal with juvenile sex offenders. And is it fair? It is not fair at all. I have a feeling that this little clip is from the PBS thing that was on the moment before this started, and I tried for a half an hour yesterday to get rid of it. So you can now know that the youngest EU country is Ireland, but you don't need to know that because that's not what I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you a little video about how to deal with juvenile sex offenders.
Next, the difficult question of how to deal with people convicted of sex crimes, specifically what to do with young juvenile offenders. Should they be locked up indefinitely? Do they belong in facilities designed for some of society's worst adult offenders? William Brangham traveled to Minnesota for this report, part of our Broken Justice series.
This facility in the rural town of Moose Lake is where Minnesota puts the sex offenders it says are too dangerous to live on the outside. 29-year-old Craig Bolte is one of them. He's been locked up for nearly half his life. It started when he was 15, when he pled guilty to sexually assaulting a younger member of his family and also admitted to sexual contact with another minor. He says these were very troubling years for him.
I was sexually abused on numerous occasions as a child when I was a young child, and that is by no means an excuse. I'm responsible for my actions. I still hurt people.
Bolte was originally sentenced to 3 years, but he's now been behind bars here in Minnesota for 14, locked up with hundreds of rapists, child abusers, and other sex offenders. They're all being kept by what's known as civil commitment law, which allows a state to deem someone an ongoing threat, and even after their sentences are served, keep them locked up indefinitely.
I've been in for about 10 years now. All in all, I've been locked up for 14 years, 10 years of the period.
The PBS NewsHour was granted rare access to Minnesota's sex offender program.
Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you.
We could film interviews inside this one room, but almost everywhere else, we could only take still photographs. Most everyone agrees that there are people locked up in Minnesota's program who are very likely to reoffend. These are people who say they simply cannot control their behavior. And that concern is why legislatures in 20 states have set up programs like this to hold these people. But others say these programs also end up snaring juvenile offenders who they argue have no business being held for years past their sentences.
It's outrageous. That is one of the more outrageous features of this program.
Eric Janis is a law professor and longtime critic of Minnesota's sex offender policies. He says juvenile sex offenders are almost never the kind of lifetime sexual predator that society needs to worry about.
Probably a fairly high percentage of adolescent sexual offending is basically due to immaturity and experimentation. And so it's not deviant sexuality. It's not that they are attracted to violent sex or involuntary sex. It's that they are immature, and that's the kind of thing that they'll grow out of.
Juvenile sexual behavior, like every other kind of behavior, changes very rapidly.
Elizabeth Letourneau is one of the nation's leading experts on juvenile sex offenders. She directs the Moore Center for the Prevention of Child Sexual Abuse at Johns Hopkins University. She says civilly committing juvenile sex offenders makes little sense, first, because it's incredibly costly. Minnesota spends about $125,000 per offender per year, which is roughly triple the cost of regular prison. But most importantly, she says it doesn't make sense because juvenile offenders are not likely lifetime offenders.
Among youth who are adjudicated for a sexual offense, so they've been arrested, processed, 97 to 98% will not reoffend sexually. So truly the vast majority
Almost all of them.
will not, almost all youth, if they are caught committing a sexual offense, will not do it again.
Emily Piper is the commissioner of Minnesota's Department of Human Services, which oversees the state's sex offender program. She says only 4% of Minnesota's registered sex offenders are currently civilly committed, and she argues the state is rightly incarcerating the most troubling of those.
The sex offenders in our program have some of the most horrible criminal histories and horrible crimes in their past of any sex offenders in our state.
However, there are currently 67 men like Craig Bolte who have been locked up for crimes they committed as juveniles. Many of these young men, dozens of them, who were put in for crimes they committed when they were juveniles, and now they're in their 30s and 40s and 50s. Is this the right place for them?
You know, I would say many of the people that are committed as juveniles don't have a lot of life experience and outside of being confined. And so when we're working with them, we need to make sure that we're appropriately and adequately reintegrating them into our society.
That's the stated goal of the program, to give mental health treatment to the offenders and release those who are deemed ready for life on the outside. But in the last 2 decades, not one person has ever been fully released back home. More than 40 have died while in commitment. The oldest man here is 94. Several are older than 70.
Once the doors close, you know really quickly that you're going to die here, and that's your only way out.
Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. is on death row.
The use of civil commitment took off in Minnesota as a result of a particularly harrowing case. Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. spent 23 years in prison for rape and attempted kidnapping. But 6 months after getting out, Rodriguez struck again, kidnapping college student Drew Shadeen.
That was at a brother's wedding in 2002.
Linda Walker is Drew's mother.
We're almost positive that he had her for 3 hours, brutally raped and tortured her, then walked her down in a ravine and slit her throat and left her to die.
Outraged that someone like Rodriguez had been set free, Walker helped create a national sex offender database where communities are notified if former offenders move into their area. And her advocacy in Minnesota helped expand that state's use of civil commitment. In 2003, less than 200 men were civilly committed in the state, but in the wake of Drew's rape and murder, that number has more than tripled to 725 today.
I realized that we needed more tools in our chests to protect our society from those that choose to violate and to rape our women and children.
So you don't think that there's any rehabilitation for this level of criminal?
I do not.
There's nothing that can be done.
I do not believe there is.
Nope. I feel horrible for Drew Shadeen's mother. I sympathize with where she's at and what's happened to her daughter. But Craig isn't even close to Alfonso, whoever did what he did. It's a total different animal in my opinion. Craig, when he was a baby with my dad.
Craig Bolte's mom, Michelle, is now one of his biggest advocates, even though she and her husband were the ones who first turned their son into the police years ago.
Honestly, when I look back, I feel like I gave my child a life sentence.
Michelle was just 14 when she gave birth to Craig. She says it was early on, when Craig was a toddler, that he was first sexually abused by an older family member who lived with them.
My family has a history of sexual abuse. I was abused. My brother was abused. Now my son was abused.
She says it's that history that led to Craig's childhood abuse of other kids. But she now believes her 29-year-old son deserves a second chance to live in society.
You can't sentence a child murderer for life. But you can, state of Minnesota, sentence a child sex offender for life. I mean, it's just total double standard. It makes no sense because you hide behind that it's treatment.
In 2011, a class action lawsuit was brought against the state by a group of offenders in Minnesota's program, including Craig Bolte, arguing they were not getting any meaningful treatment and were instead being held indefinitely. And last year, a federal district judge in St. Paul sided with them, saying that Minnesota's sex offender program was unconstitutional, ruling, quote, "It's a punitive system that segregates and indefinitely detains a class of potentially dangerous individuals without the safeguards of the criminal justice system." The state has appealed the decision and a ruling is expected this fall. In the meantime, state officials say they've already started making changes. 5 offenders have been moved into less restrictive settings, and new reviews are being done of all offenders to determine who's a potential candidate for release and who isn't. Even Drew Shadeen's mother, Linda Walker, admits that maybe some juvenile cases should be re-examined. But she hopes that in all its reforms, Minnesota will err on the side of caution before releasing anyone.
We're constantly taking the victims out of the equation every time we sit and analyze these people. And what about their freedom? They don't get it back. Drew's never going to get hers back.
Craig Bolte says he's a changed man and that he's hopeful for the first time that he might one day get out.
There's a lot of people who will hear what you have to say and that they're simply not going to forgive what you did. And so they say, look, lock them up and throw away the key. What is your response to that? What do you say to those people?
So let me prove it. Let me show you what kind of man I am today. Let me prove that I'm not the kid that I was that did those things.
In addition to the changes in Minnesota, Missouri and Texas have also recently begun reviewing their civil commitment programs for sex offenders. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm William Brangham in Moose Lake, Minnesota.
We continue our Broken Justice series tomorrow with a report on education.
Okay, I realize that these are not always the most fun things to watch. But the reason I show that to you is you certainly can see how people make decisions about this, not with their heads. They make them with their hearts. I mean, God bless that mother. Of course, she's never going to get her daughter back. But one of the things that, if we're going to look at this, there is a difference between this adult sex offender who says, if you let me out, I will offend again. And there are plenty of them who say, if you let me out of prison, I am going to offend again. I am going to commit more sexual crimes. And a kid who was 14 when this happened, who's now 29. So, but people are very emotional about decisions like this. And certainly, if you're following anything about the Nicholas Cruz sentencing, that thing has gone completely off the rails with those people now on their 4th round of telling Nicholas Cruz what they think about him for killing their children. And I don't think I've ever seen anything like this in a courtroom before, but they're emotional because their kids are dead. This woman who lost her daughter, she's emotional. Her daughter's never going to come back, but her daughter was killed by an adult sex offender who probably said, if you let me out, I'm gonna do this again. That's a whole different animal than what we're dealing with here. Does anybody have any reactions to that at all? I mean, should they be let out?
I think whether they should be let out or not really depends on your perspective. When I think about, we have children referred to our TTP program for treatment. And then when they graduate, we're told, well, they can't ever go back home because of what happened before they went to treatment. Well, if you were going to punish them, why did you send them to that kind of treatment? It is my take on that. But then if it was a child in my family that had been hurt and you knew there was a risk, I would say, why didn't you prevent that risk? I really think it depends on your perspective and your
which side of the victimization do you land on?
Exactly.
Because like when she's talking about Nicholas Cruz and these victim impact statements, if he had shot to death my child at Parkland, I would absolutely want to be able to stand up in court and say, because of you, the thing I love most in the world doesn't exist anymore. And I'm mad about that, and I want you to spend the rest of your life in jail. Yeah, absolutely, I would want that. Do I care if I've lost my child to a school shooter or whatever, that he had a rough life? No, because he took my life away. He took the thing I care about most. So I have a lot of trouble finding sympathy. And I was while we were watching that, I was looking up the news reports on Nicole and the young man that did the shooting. He actually only ended up with 3 years in juvenile facility because he took a plea deal. His attorney set him down on a plea deal. So he's spending the next 3 years in a juvenile detention type facility appropriate for his age. And she is being charged as an adult because she was charged with attempted first-degree murder of a law enforcement officer, which is automatically a life sentence in the state of Florida because of the way our laws work. But they've given her a potential plea agreement that she's refusing to take because she wants to go in front of a jury, not a judge. So I did a little research on that because you shoot at the police and that's going to be a bad day.
She's going to be life either way. Life with parole or life without.
No, she'll get 20 years. She'll get 20 years with a possibility of parole in 15 as opposed to a full-time life sentence.
If she's convicted.
If she's convicted.
Yeah, there's no good end. There's no good end for those kids. There's no good end for Nicholas Cruz. I think what I want you to come away with, there can be a good end for these kids. But in many states, once they get in prison, they have these civil commitment things that make them it's almost impossible for them to get out. Because if I was asked to put my professional license on the line to say that young man will never offend again, you'd be hard pressed to do it. It's almost impossible to find psychiatrists or psychologists to make that statement. So they
right. Well, that's, I mean, if you think about the way the people that become our legislators, right? They have constituencies who are sometimes angry mobs with pitchforks and torches. But they designed the laws to say things like that in order to ensure that they maintain people in the criminal justice system, because the reality is now with privatizations of prisons, it's a money-making reality for a lot of people. Like, it's just like big pharma or big ag or big anything else. Corrections is a huge money-making venture.
Well, that takes us off into a whole other philosophical discussion that we'll never settle today. Come away with one thing, that if you come away with one thing from a video, and there's plenty of videos like that on YouTube, it is not hard to find it, that we have a lot of emotionality around sex offending, and we apply some of that emotionality to a juvenile offender, and they aren't always able to get equitable treatment because of that. If you heard what that boy said, he came from a family of incest, and he had been molested, his mom had been molested, his brother had been molested, and then he offended. But because of the way our country works, he was not able to get out. And I don't know, but because I didn't have time to do research on that particular young man, I don't know where that stands now in Minnesota, because that, I believe, was filmed 5 years ago. But it would be interesting to see where that ended up.
But let's bring that back to one of the kids that we have or had.
Go ahead.
We have Landon in our cottage. You didn't have Landon. We had Landon who was clearly sexualized. Mm-hmm. We know he needed treatment. He didn't get that for a long list of things that were out of our control. If he does something, should he be sentenced for the rest of his life when his needs have gone unmet through the foster care system? Or should he serve the rest of his life anyway?
He failed twice.
Do what you say?
He was failed twice from his family, and he got failed in the foster care system.
and not just that failed in the foster care system, they put him back with someone who was clearly criminal. Like, he clearly had criminality in his history.
But when you do it in real world,
They don't care.
how we feel ain't gonna matter.
No.
So Barbara, let me catch you up. This was a young kid, 12, 11, 10?
And when he
10.
came to us,
10 when he came here, who was incredibly sexualized. He could tell us all the porn sites we needed to go to, and if we got angry or upset or whatever, he could tell us.
He knew all the things about all the things.
He knew everything. We recommended he leave here and go to TTP. That was to happen, and we packed him up. He told our cottage goodbye. The morning that he was to move, his case manager didn't come get him and said she couldn't find a transporter, so they weren't going to take him to TTP. They were just going to send him home with his dad.
I remember this case, Micah. You called me about this case. I remember it very well.
Okay, so he didn't last a weekend with his dad. Since then, his dad has been arrested for
Reckless endangerment of a minor child under the age of 2, possession of illegal substances over X number of grams, felony possession of a firearm by a convicted felon, blah, 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 blah.
He basically they were using drugs around a toddler, and the toddler ingested. And so, but he could easily continue his pattern of sexual acting out, be labeled a sex offender, and go this path that this young guy in Minnesota has gone. What would our stance in that situation be?
They're all tough ones, but I think the reality is Landon, even at 10 and 11, when we talked to Landon about what was appropriate and what wasn't appropriate conversation, what was appropriate behavior and wasn't appropriate behavior, Landon had the beginning of understanding of what was and wasn't appropriate, right? Like, Landon could know that what you didn't say to Shanika was, your hair looks like a dildo, or you need to go buy a dick on Amazon, which are things he did say, or between him or Eli, I can't remember which Eli was one that told her hair looked like a dildo, that's right.
Landon told her about where to go.
Yeah, Landon told her he still could dildo, that's right. Like, Landon understood that when he's yelling down the hall, all the things he was yelling down the hall, that those weren't appropriate things to be yelling. He knew. He didn't care, because, boys doing the boys things that they were doing and talking and made him feel big and bad. I mean, like, Landon knew how to behave. He behaved well at school all the time. He was good at school. He didn't get in trouble at school. He knew how to stay within the line.
He did get in trouble at school until I told him if I got another call, I was going to come sit beside him in school. That's when he stopped acting out at school. He didn't get suspended. He was just disruptive.
Yeah, he was disruptive. And I think we changed his meds too, didn't we? Get him on ADHD meds? Did something for him. One of them got meds. I don't know.
But there's a history like that behind every kid.
And there's a ton of kids that have that history and don't commit crime. I mean, the reality is it all comes down to personal choice and the consequences that come with personal choices and making solid ones or not so solid ones. And if you get caught, it gets reported.
And the personal opinions and experiences of who takes the report.
Correct.
Yeah. I heard somebody on this side of the room say something about first his father failed him and then the foster care system failed him. These kids have just been failed repeatedly down the line. And if you have children of your own, you try so hard to teach them good values and what they should do in life. But most of the kids who show up on your campus haven't had any of that. They haven't had any kind of pro-social learning. They haven't had good parenting. They certainly haven't had good experiences in the foster care system, or they wouldn't be there. They wouldn't be with you. So it sounds to me like you did the beginning of treatment. And honestly, and I've said this to Micah before, I don't know why you'd send anybody down to the main campus when you do such a good job with that stuff right here in Madison, that you are a pretty cohesive unit. And if your job with a sexualized kid is to re-educate them appropriately, why can't you do that? You already were doing it. It's not your fault that the case manager didn't come and get him. It's not your fault that he was sent off with a clearly inappropriate father. But it sounds like you were doing the beginning of what we call treatment. It doesn't have to be specialized treatment. It just has to be, this is the appropriate way to behave. This is the appropriate way that people in the world behave sexually. We don't yell down the hall about dildos. We don't masturbate in front of people. We behave appropriately. You were, from what I can tell, and from talking to Micah about this kid before, you were already doing that. I mean, what are they gonna, and I'm asking this as an honest question because I don't know what your TTP program is about, but what were they going to get? What was that kid gonna get if you sent him down to Enterprise that you couldn't have given him yourselves?
I don't think that we have, the only clinical information we have is this book for juvenile sex offenders. I would have to literally.
I think the therapist there, Harriet, specializes in this level of treatment, or this type of treatment,
but it's
right?
sex offender treatment. It's not an educational program on re-educating our kids. It's actually an adult book for adult sex offenders.
Oh, no, I don't do that part of it. I do that.
So, I mean, as you talk, Barbara, it makes me think that is a program that we had in Macon that that's not my area. I didn't learn it. I could learn it and maybe duplicate it. But we wouldn't know any more to do than just the behavioral interventions that we were doing and processing it with them.
That's treatment. You don't treat kids by workbook, and you certainly don't treat them by a workbook that's made for adult sex offenders. What you were doing is the beginning of treatment. What you were doing was recognizing just basic trauma remediation. That here is a kid who sounds like he had a lot of things happen to him that shouldn't have happened to him. And again, it's not your fault that it ended up the way it did, but it did sound like you were on the right track. Just because you don't have a program that you call TTP, sounds like you were on the right track.
I will say, I have said a gazillion times, if I had that to do over again, I would do it totally different. I would have blasted that case manager in the courtroom, and I would have blasted the GAL. I didn't, because I didn't know what my role was, but given the outcome, I don't care what my role is anymore. I would rather them tell me to hush, I'm out of line in court, than to have a child experience what he did. So I would do that differently.
I mean, we know he was smoking pot with his dad driving to New Orleans. We have those emails.
But court was before that.
Yeah. Well, we know that happened after the fact, after he was discharged to his father's care.
You know, there's a lot of very bad outcomes in child welfare that almost have nothing to do with what the parents did to begin with. I mean, what the parents start, the child welfare system can often finish. So, and I say that, and having been working in the child welfare system my whole entire adult life, it is an imperfect system that's meant to deal with imperfect problems. And you have a lot of people, like a case manager who maybe was in a hurry to get home to her own kid that day, that along the line make a lot of bad decisions that kind of cascade and snowball as they did for your little boy. And that's really unfortunate because you couldn't fix it and you couldn't change it. But that's a whole different system. And let me just say, and I'm going to give you guys a break in a minute, I honestly think, Micah, you do not need to have a specialized program to know that a kid that has trauma in their background, be it sexual or physical or neglect or whatever, you treat the trauma first. And that's what you're doing. So that's my soapbox for Madison. Micah knows I've been on it before. So. All right, it's 10 o'clock, you guys. Take a 10-minute break and we'll get back into this. I think sometimes people need a little breather.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, it looks like you're all back, so. Or maybe you didn't go anyplace to begin with, so. All right, we've already covered some of this, so we're gonna go through it kind of quick. All of these things that we put up there are fiction. They are not true, but they are, when I say they're truisms, a truism is something that everybody believes and it isn't true. So we have a lot of truisms going on in our country right now, depending on which side of the fence you sit on. But there's a lot of things that are widely thought about. The stolen election is a truism because many people believe that the 2020 election was stolen, despite the fact that there's really been absolutely no evidence to that. That's a truism. A lot of these things are truisms, that a lot of people think that there is a lot more juvenile sex offending than there has been in the past. Now, perhaps that is just because we see a lot more written about it. We certainly see a lot written in sections like entertainment sections, where people in the entertainment industry kind of routinely talk about their sexuality and that they're gay, they're straight, they're trans, they're pansexual, et cetera, et cetera. So there's just a lot more conversation in general in the media about it, but there is no more sex offending, juvenile sex offending than there has been at any point in the past. This really is a big one, and it has to do with the fact that your trauma treatment program, I believe, it kind of goes in this direction a little, that juvenile sex offenders are not the same as adult sex offenders. And there are programs, University Behavioral Center was one of them, where juvenile sex offenders were subjected to adult sex offender treatment. And it's a very different kind of treatment.
Hey, Barbara, would you share what the difference is between a juvenile sex offender and an adult sex offender? What are those differences?
Adult sex offender treatment. Oops, sorry. I can't seem to get rid of that. Adult sex offender treatment is really based on the fact that this person was an adult. They knew what they were doing. It was a planful attempt to hurt another individual. Therefore, the treatment is based on getting that adult sex offender to admit his guilt, to admit that he needs to apologize to his victim, that he needs to show empathy for his victim. But it is based on the fact that you, as the perpetrator, are an adult, and adults are capable of making certain decisions. If you are working with a 14 or a 15 or a 16-year-old, and we certainly do a lot of this training at Circle of Friends, the human brain is not fully formed and capable of making complete adult decisions until an individual is 25 or 26 years old. And that is not myth. That is neurologically based scientific evidence that you are not capable of making those decisions until you're 25 or 26 years old. So to go back to Nicole Johnson and whatever that little boy's name was, they were 12 and 14. So even though the law says they can be tried as adults, were they capable of making fully formed adult decisions when they were in that guy's house, caught up in that fantasy about whatever that television show was that they were talking about?
Grand Theft Auto.
Grand Theft Auto, thank you. They were kids and they were caught up in that fantasy, and they were using kid brains to make those decisions, which is why I personally have a hard time with having these young people tried as adults. But that is the biggest difference. So therefore, when some of these juvenile sex offender programs were first put together, and this kind of goes back to the 90s, we already had adult sex offender programs. Were they successful? Honestly, they aren't any more successful than the famous batterers intervention programs, which are supposed to get people to stop beating up their spouses. And those are incredibly unsuccessful as well. But we based our juvenile sex offender treatment on what we did with adults. So we got them together in a group. We made them admit that they were wrong. We made them admit that what they did was based on a decision that really they weren't capable of making, and that they needed to apologize to their victims. Now, there is nothing wrong with apologizing to somebody that you have hurt. Don't get me wrong. But the difference is that you can't take a 14-year-old brain and make it function like a 25-year-old brain. So that's kind of it. Does that answer your question, Micah?
It does, but here's my follow-up to that. If the brain isn't fully developed until you're 25, 26, what about college students or those out of college that engage in these behaviors? They're considered adults, but yet their brain isn't developed.
They also have
The law considers you an adult when you're 18. So the law will, I think you're talking about things like date rape and those university frat parties and all of that stuff where people get into trouble. And the bottom line is that the brain is not fully formed. And you go off to college and you do these things and you get drunk and you get high, and now you're even less in control. But the law is going to say that you were an adult and you can be tried as such. The way we look at juvenile sex offenders is very skewed compared to the way we should, but it's what we have right now. And it's also the problem that I have. I know the workbook that you're talking about, Micah, and I remember researching that workbook when I first found out it was being used. And it is very much based on adult sex offender symptomology and treatment models. So, and you can't treat by workbook, and you have to start with the trauma first. You take your little Landon, who obviously had some difficult history. How would you ever have been able to, if you'd had him long enough, to treat that boy without having to be able to recognize what had happened to him and how it was affecting his behaviors? You wouldn't have been able to, because if you didn't look at that, you wouldn't have been able to look past his bad behaviors, and you would have just said, this kid is a sexual deviant brat, and that's not going to help anything either.
Did you have a follow-up?
I did have a follow-up. Barbara, are there longitudinal studies that track juveniles into adulthood to evaluate recidivism rates after they've been convicted of a juvenile sex offense as to whether they recidivate as an adult sex offender? Are those longitudinal studies other than like Coldwell and Rasmussen, or are there other ones in addition to those?
There are lots. There's lots of research about that, which is why we don't say these things lightly. When you heard that woman is on several different, the one that was speaking before, who said that less than 4% of them repeat. Those are based on longitudinal studies. Those are based on following those kids into adulthood, and they don't reoffend. Adults can reoffend, but adults have made those decisions with different brains. And a lot of what, without getting too gory, a lot of what you saw in that video with the guy who reoffended within 6 months of getting out, that's a whole different kind of sexual deviant personality that you see showing up in adulthood. And I don't know that it's terribly well understood. Do you all remember the situation? His name was Castro, the guy who kept the 3 girls in his house in Chicago for like 10 years. They finally got out, and one of the girls finally escaped, and they were all rescued. And he was imprisoned, and he died in prison. He wasn't in prison for very long. But oddly enough, one of the things that his attorney wanted was for his brain to be donated to science, to see if there could be some kind of research onto why he did the things he did. The same with, who was the football player in Florida that he died in prison as well? see, I'm not, and it just happened. I'm not going to be able to remember the name. Who was the football player that was on trial in Florida who had committed some pretty serious crimes, and he blamed it on brain abnormalities. And when he died, he wanted his brain to be donated to science too. Now I'm going to have to look that up now that I've told you that story, because it didn't happen all that long ago.
Hernandez.
Thank you. What crime did he commit?
Aaron Hernandez.
Who did he play for? Florida.
And what crime did he commit?
Breaking in, theft.
Hold on one second. He played for the Patriots professionally. He was tight end. He went to Florida.
He played for Florida.
Let's see. Hold on one second. He was arrested for the murder of Lloyd, a semi-professional player dating the sister of his fiancée. Found guilty of first-degree murder, sentenced to life in prison. Blah 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 blah. He was
And
found
he
dead.
died. Supposedly he committed suicide in prison, I think.
He was found dead in his cell. It was ruled a suicide, but after they did the autopsy and the post-mortem, he was diagnosed with chronic traumatic encephalopathy, so CTE.
He was a football player, right?
Chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which just means chronic brain injury, like TBI.
Like concussions, like many.
Multiple TBI, traumatic brain injury, so concussion syndrome.
There is a documentary on him.
Yeah, Will Smith did a really good job playing in a movie about, not him, but that TBI stuff.
Well, and again, these are chronic offenders. These are adults. Whether he had brain injury, I don't know what Castro's reason was, but he kept those women locked in his basement for 10 years. One of them had a child with him. One of them got pregnant several times, and he caused her to miscarry. It was not a small crime. That's a different thing than you heard on that video, a kid who's making decisions based on the fact that they're young, they're immature, they're exposed to some kind of sexual behavior, and they act out sexually. They're probably not going to repeat. That's the biggest thing that we have to remember about this population, that research does not support that they're going to repeat. In fact, it says they have a very low rate of recidivism. And most of these kids are not going to become adult sex offenders. So that's the kind of like emotional fear that we have when we're talking about you got to keep them in jail forever. But that doesn't make any sense. So.
But Miss Barbara, can they say that about some of these adults that have went through certain things in their childhood and grow up to have these urges? Like the ones that when they were younger, something happened to them, like they had someone to do something to them, but then in the same breath, they've gotten over the age of 25. Now they do have the adult brain, but there's still something in them that kind of, I kind of say click, and they still do these type of things.
Yeah.
Like these sexual offenses.
Well, and let me just say that is a very sad part of our criminal justice system, because a lot of people who are convicted like that are young men of color, and they are viewed through a different lens, and they very often have had very little help for any kind of childhood traumas that they have had. And it doesn't mean that childhood traumas cannot translate themselves into adult criminal behavior, because they can. Our goal here is to try to get these kids before they grow up, to give them some kindness, some understanding of what their behaviors are translating into. And that's really where you guys come in. The Hernandez, Castro, some of the ones that we see, I mean, obviously the more well-known ones are like Jeffrey Dahmer, but we see that these people often had something awful in their childhood that was left untreated and grew into what it grew into. That's why we're doing this training. We don't want your kids to get that far. But Do I think that happens? Yeah, happens all the time. And when we look at the statistics on it, you know the statistics are very bad for boys versus girls in terms of boys having had less treatment and boys of color having had less treatment, having had no treatment, having been judged through an awful lens from the time they're children. So if those, you probably, go ahead.
As you talk, though, I'm thinking about, I go back to Landon, and I think, yes, we did provide him with the interventions, the behavioral interventions, but I don't feel like in his child brain, we had any credibility, because what we were saying was foreign to him, it was not fun, and it was very structured. And so I hear you that yes, we were providing treatment, but as I process all of that, that's, to me, that's the value of having a quote treatment program, is it gives a stronger credibility to the information being given.
Well, I also think where we weren't serving Landon is we had female residents, and he was super hypersexualized around female anatomy and females. And the reality was, is if there was a girl within 500 feet of Landon, it was problematic for Landon because he was clued into all of those things about females, especially the females we had at the time. So I think.
How long was he with you?
About 6 months, 5 to 6 months.
Yeah. It's kind of a drop in the bucket when you think about it.
May to October.
You didn't have him long enough. And you know, Micah and I have had this conversation before. There is absolutely no reason that you cannot wrap some structure around what you are doing. We have a trauma treatment program at Circle of Friends. We set it up ourselves. We trained the therapist. We set the guidelines. We set the rules. We decided what the program was going to be, and we have pretty good results from it. It's based on research. It's based on what good treatment should be, and it is also based on trauma first and behavior second. So.
Have you ever, this is just a question that just came in my head. Have you ever had a child or children where it was just like, you know what, they were so deep into their sexual traumas or so sexualized that that it was like a point where you thought, okay, I don't think there's nothing that I can do for them. And you kind of had a sense of when they get older, you know that there's going to be an issue when they get older as far as it concerns sex with them?
That's a really good question.
Or criminal behavior?
I would have to say sure. There have been some kids, especially when they were older, maybe 15, 16, that I look at and think, I don't know how to turn this ship around. Most of the time, no, because most of the time, if you start with what happened to them and try to work through that, you do eventually see a crack. But I think the problem that you guys have is that you can't control how long they're with you. If Landon had been with you for maybe even another 6 months, you might have started to see him turn around a little bit. But hold on a second. Just let me tell her that I'll call her right back. Hey, Carol.
I wonder what
Let me call you when I'm done with my training. Okay, thanks. Bye. I think that Landon was probably pretty far gone, but it doesn't mean that you couldn't if you had had enough time. If you had become more the nurturing, structuring person in his life that meant something to him, I think you probably could have turned him around. A lot of it is timing. You didn't have enough time. I have honestly, to go back to the root of your question, I can think of a couple of kids that I would be sitting with thinking, oh my God, I don't know what to do now. I have tried everything I can think of. And usually right at the point that I was tearing my hair out, they would say, you know, you're right, Miss Barbara, I knew that all along. But it was really the boys that I had so much more of a struggle with, and the boys that have been forced to be involved in incestuous relationships with their siblings. The more extreme it is, the harder it is to turn it around. It doesn't mean you can't, and boy, I would never give up. But that was a pretty heavy question. The last thing I'm going to talk about, and then we're going to move on to something else, is that we say residential treatment is the best thing for juvenile sex offenders, and it's usually not. Because if you think about kids that have gotten involved in any kind of juvenile offenses, there's a lot of factors that have failed them. Landon's home failed him. The people around him failed him. The child welfare system failed him. So taking a child out of all of those factors and putting them in a residential treatment center, for one thing, what does that say to the kid? I mean, that says you're so far gone that I don't know that there's anything we can do with you. And putting them in something like a university behavioral center, which is locked, to make it even worse, and then make them sit around in a group and say, tell me what you did and tell me why you did it and apologize to your victim and all of that kind of thing, just made a lot of these kids worse. And I think we did see that. Community-based treatment is really probably going to keep kids within a community where there's some kind of support system around them, whether it's in school, whether it's around with their peers, whether it's in community-based programs. We really prefer to keep them in the community. So treatment is geared for adult offenders, and it is just not effective. Did anybody have any questions before we kind of move along? I feel like I've beaten this to death at this point. But you guys do ask some good questions. What mistakes?
We're all just processing all the information. We're all just kind of like,
I know, it's a lot. We make a lot of mistakes. I'm a member of the clinical community, and we do make a lot of mistakes. I watch a lot of mistakes being made, which is why a couple of years ago, when we were getting especially during the pandemic, for whatever reason, we began to get an awful lot of incest cases, and we had up in the Panhandle. I've got all kinds of clients that are up in the Panhandle. There's a place called Disc Village that keeps sending us clients, and they wanted us to work with some of their incest victims. And that's where our trauma treatment program came from, because I sat here one day and said, well, I know how we need to do this, so we're going to set it up. And maybe to go back to Micah's point, we gave it a name. We just call it the Sexual Trauma Treatment Program. And maybe giving it a name gives it some credibility. I don't know. Maybe that's why we got all these people from the Panhandle. But we decided that we were going to treat the trauma first. The mistake that the clinical community makes, and the mistake I see other therapists making all the time, is they're going to treat the offending behavior first. And how do you treat offending behavior? Stop doing that. So we decided that we were going to look for assessments that would evaluate how much trauma these kids have gone through, that we were going to place the trauma treatment first, that we were not going to use anything that could have been used on adult offenders, and we were going to keep the kids as much as we could in their homes and their schools. Now, where does that get tricky? Where that gets tricky is with the sibling cases, where we have the 14-year-old boy who's possibly offended on his 6-year-old sister, and I can't tell you how much we had of that during the pandemic, because everybody was home, and their parents were distracted because of what was happening in the world at that point. And part of what we have done at Circle of Friends is to try to work with the whole family to say, the first thing parents do is take the offending kid and ship them off to grandma's or another relative in another state. And when you say, well, what's your plan to bring him home? They never plan to bring him home. Well, of course you're going to bring him home. He's your son. And in the meantime, the little girl who's been offended is missing her brother. So family things don't stop because there have been mistakes made. So we've really tried to kind of change our focus on what we're doing to help families to understand where this comes from and how we can fix it. A lot of families think it's like the kiss of death, that they can never put their family back together again. And I have to say, I hear a lot of that on the main campus with some of those kids that end up on the main campus because they've offended on a younger sibling. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why is it important for caregivers to participate. It doesn't mean you have to be their therapist. It just means you have to support them. And if you understand what has happened to them, if you understand where their behaviors are coming from, and I'm going to go back to Landon, it sounds like he gave you all kinds of stuff that was on his mind or stuff that he was thinking. It sounds like he gave you an awful lot of, this is where my head is. And maybe he wouldn't have been giving that to you if on some part of his brain, he didn't want that turned around. So, but again, you just didn't have him long enough. And it does sound like you were on the right track with him. I'm going to talk about some of the stuff that we've seen kids do over time. This little girl was referred to a group home in Deltona, and she was referred because she had been engaging in some sexually reactive behavior. And she was a client that I began working with because at the time there wasn't anybody else that could work with her. And it was pretty clear almost immediately that she had had a pretty extensive history of childhood sexual abuse. She began to draw pictures for me. This again is not Megan, this is a stock picture. She began to draw pictures. It was very clear that she had had some kind of molestation in her background. But she left this on my desk when she left, and I just thought it was cute. I came by to say bye, and you weren't there, but I'll see and talk to you soon. Thanks for everything. There's no way I could have done this without you. I love you very much, even though you were a little fruity at times, and I'll miss you. And in typical teenage girl fashion, call me later. I was never going to see her again. She was gone. But mine, I could have made a big mistake with her. I could have just landed on her sexually reactive behaviors. And I really kept thinking, where did this come from? And it was a childhood history. So I want to show you just a little bit of some of the stuff that some of our kids have done for us with our therapists. All you need to do as part of the child's treatment process is just let them know that you're willing. If they need to talk to you, if they want to talk to you with the therapist, if the therapist says, I'm going to have kind of a heavy session, would you sit in with me? There is nothing wrong with you doing that. You are the kid's main supports. And you need to be able to let them know that you don't think they're bad, because most people in positions of authority have always told them that they're bad. And when we talk about the story, kids show us their story in a lot of different ways. Some kids, like Megan told me finally that this is what happened to her. The young man on the video said, I was molested when I was a kid. But some of our kids don't do that. We've learned a lot of different ways to take what we call the trauma narrative. Some kids write it down. Some kids will draw it. Some kids will show you in play. But again, you don't have to be a therapist. You just have to know that if you find something on their desk and they've drawn it and it's diagnostic, bring it to Alexis and say, what do you think about this? This was a trauma narrative in art. This was a 5-year-old, and she had been molested by her dad. And it was kind of hard. I mean, this is obviously, when we talk about art therapy, this is a pretty disconnected kid. When you see, even at 5, a kid who draws the head disconnected from the body, that's a pretty disconnected kid. What she was trying to draw, it took us a while to figure this out. She was trying to draw her vagina, and she was trying to draw his penis. And the therapist wrote this down, because the therapist who was working with her said, can you tell me what this is? Can you help me to understand? You're trying to tell me something. And she finally said, this is a picture of Dad kissing me down there. And again, she was only 5, so it's a little difficult when they're that little to figure out what they're trying to show you. It's almost impossible with child victims this young to get them any justice.
Yeah, but he may have been victimized himself. I don't care. He was a grown-ass man and control.
We're looping back the conversation, Barbara, of should that father die, or do we see him as a victim himself? So
I think listen, okay, so this is Neva, and this is my thing, because I'm like, I'm sorry, this is her father, and she is a baby of 5. I do not want to help him. I want to put him in the ground. I want to help that baby live a long, happy life, and I know that's her dad, and I know she needs a parent, and I know all of those things logically, because I can be a logical human being. But in this moment, I'm having a strong emotional reaction to someone who hurts a little baby 5-year-old.
Well, last week we talked about this a little bit. This is hard work, and you have a perfect right to have emotional reactions like that. I have emotional reactions like that when I'm dealing with kids. It isn't helpful for you to share those reactions with your kids.
Oh, I would never share them with my kids, but I am sharing them with my coworkers.
We do share them with each other, because that's the way that we kind of assess where we are.
It's how we try to deal with our trauma, that is the secondary trauma of it.
Yeah.
This was at 5 years old whenever she was drawing this picture, so it had to have happened before she was 5.
Yeah.
Right. This is a baby.
That he was kissing.
But I see the dad as Landon.
Yeah.
The dad.
But what about the mamas that's doing the same thing?
Right.
Yeah.
The mamas that's doing it to their daughters, to their sons.
Or selling their kids.
Right.
Or staying with the dad that they know is doing that.
Right.
Yeah.
Because you do,
Equal opportunity.
You have mothers that pimp their daughters out.
Oh, yeah.
I've witnessed it.
Yeah.
I had an aunt that pimped out her granddaughter.
Okay. I don't know anything about this little girl other than this picture, because this is an old picture. I can tell you, kind of going along with what Neva said, that one of my therapists, she has since retired, was with me for a long time, and she did a lot of sexual trauma work, and she was pretty good at it for the most part, but it became clear over time that Judy had her own history of, and sometimes therapists don't tell you, they just show you by the way they act. And I used to say to her, Judy, whatever you feel about this father that did this to this little girl who is your client, you cannot say to this little girl, your dad is, she used to call the perpetrators butt ugly guys. And you can't say that. You cannot tell a 5-year-old that her father is a butt ugly guy. You have got to stay on the other side of this window where you are trying to help her to understand, because you don't know what happened here. But it's really hard with little ones, and I get Neva's reaction, because I've had 4 and 5-year-olds, and I also know that we're not going to get any kind of legal justice for them because the legal system doesn't think they're old enough to testify.
That is
so
exactly right.
Usually no physical evidence to any of this. Girls can be molested with no physical evidence, so they're not going to get any justice, and that's a hard thing. I think that besides the reaction that I obviously got out of all of you, I think the interesting thing is that she was 5, and she was able to pretty clearly, once we figured it out, this is where she was going with this. And that's a pretty disturbing picture, isn't it, for a 5-year-old? And this was one of mine. This was also a 5-year-old, and her dad was the perpetrator. Very often, perpetrators don't physically hurt their victims. They don't want to physically hurt their victims, because if they physically hurt them, then they can't continue what they're doing. And she was a Children's Advocacy Center client, and her mother brought her in because she had discovered that the father, who she had now separated from, had been molesting the little girl. And it was Valentine's Day. And she drew this on the whiteboard in my office. So I had to take a picture of it because whiteboards are not permanent. But she drew these three little hearts. Again, it was Valentine's Day. She drew it very quickly. And so I said to her, what are these things down here? And she said, those are all butterflies, and they're kissing the privates of the Valentines. Now, I'm not expecting a 5-year-old to come up with an explanation like that. So she said they're butterflies and they're kissing their privates. And it was, again, she wasn't going to get any justice either. I think the only justice she got is that the mother left the father and booted him out of the house. But as a 5-year-old, these are hard cases, because how do you explain to a 5-year-old, try to help a 5-year-old to understand that, well, dad is gone because he shouldn't have been doing the things he was doing to you. They're not fun. This girl was 9. This is a very recent picture. This girl had been living with her grandmother. This was a big Mexican family, and they were all in a trailer together in Hillsborough County. And this little girl, her name was Yaseret, was living with the grandmother and the grandfather. The grandfather wasn't really her grandfather. He was a step grandfather, and he was an alcoholic. And she never said one thing about him until she went home to her mother, and she was separated from him, which is often when kids will tell you something. And she drew this whole picture is the grandfather taking her to get pizza. And you can see that he doesn't look like the nicest guy in the world. And there's the pizza, and there's her. And I'm not 100% sure what this is back here, because she said that he would take her out alone to get pizza. And then what she said, you should not have done that at the car. She said, Grandpa, you should not have done that at the car, but you did. And what she's drawing is, there's his hand coming towards her, and there's her looking pretty unhappy. And that's how the therapist found out, because she said, Yaseret, just draw me a picture. So Yaseret did. And this therapist had been with this little girl for a long time, and kept saying, I don't know about this grandfather. I don't have a good feeling about him. And this was just last year. But there's a lot of detail in there that is pretty credible. And this is the last one I'm going to show you. And this is what I mean about sometimes your kids will show you something in a sand tray. This was a little girl, had just come in to the Enterprise campus. And she was in Bacon Cottage, because at the time Bacon Cottage was the STGH. And she had come in, and Deb Mahoney was her therapist. Deb has now retired. This is probably 5 years ago. And she came into Deb's office, and Deb had just come from a sand tray training. I had just done a training showing them how to do sand tray. And she had a bag of sand tray stuff. And the little girl said, "What can I play with this?" And Deb said, "Sure, go ahead." So she built this in the sand. Now I blew this up as much as I could, because this is a baby. All good sand trays have to have a little miniature baby. And this is a baby, and this was a toy soldier. We always put toy soldiers in the packages. And she built this whole scene. It took her about 2 seconds. And she built this scene, and if you know anything about sand tray, and I don't expect you to, she has a lot of defensive stuff. She's got all this stuff around the baby. She's got army soldiers with guns around the baby. She's got a lion around the baby. But on top of the baby is a man. And Deb looked down, Deb came down to me and said, I was just typing, and I looked down, and she had put this stuff in the sand tray. And she said, what is that? And the little girl, her name was Faith. said, the perpetrator is on the baby. And so Deb immediately paid attention and said, well, what do you mean the perpetrator is on the baby? And the little girl said, I don't want to talk about it. Little girl goes back over to her cottage. A week later, she has a flare up of genital herpes and herpes of the mouth. So at that point, we put the sand tray together with the physical symptoms and determined that she was that she was a sexual abuse victim. But that's not why she came in. She came in because of behaviors. And I think I do have one more. This is another one of your little kids from Bumsh. And I think Angela knew this kid as well. When you take sand tray pictures, you're not supposed to take the kids. I have to say to the kids, I need to take a picture, but you can't be in it. And this kid, I just could not get him out of the picture. So I had to Photoshop him out. But again, there's the baby, and the baby is in the middle. And there's all this stuff around the baby. There's all of this aggressive stuff around the baby. And what he said was, nobody is protecting the baby. This was a little boy who had tried to disclose sexual abuse to his therapist by his uncle. And his mother denied it. And unfortunately, when the CPI came out, the CPI wasn't able to get enough out of him to support the situation. So, but when the therapist came over and said, look at this sand tray, what do you think? I said, I think what he's trying to tell you is that he's in the middle and nobody's supporting him. So this kid eventually ended up okay. He ended up being adopted out of the children's home. He's probably a teenager now. But I get all that to say, there's just a lot of ways that kids show you what's happened to them.
Are the ones that we know being studied? I'm the one that's convicted.
So I would just say that kids are going to show you in a lot of different ways. Just pay attention. And if you don't understand what they're trying to tell you, ask Alexa. All right, Micah, what do you want to do? You want to do these or do you want to do your stuff?
Neva votes our stuff.
All right, let me have it.
All right, so it happened yesterday. I went down to the cottage and I was just checking in with all the kids, and I do, as a residential manager, I do a, hey, does anybody need to talk to me? Does anybody need anything? Anybody need to talk to me? And so we step out onto the porch in my quote unquote office on the porch, just so I can do a touch base with the kids. Like, I like to check in. And like, I was congratulating a couple of kids on getting their F's up to A's, blah, 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 blah. Cool. One of our young ladies comes out. She's 11. I know she has a history of sexual trauma and sexual abuse. And she comes outside and she was talking to me about her progressive presentation and blah, 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 blah. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, she says, today's my brother's birthday. And I said, it is. How do you, I said, it is, which brother? Because I can't remember how many she has off the top of my head. She has one. He was one of her perpetrators. And she says, my brother Jesse, he's the one that did all that sex stuff to me, and he's one of the reasons I'm here. But I've forgiven him, and, you know, it's okay. I just really wish I could talk to him today because it's his birthday, and I still love him. So Neva is standing there, neutral look on my face. I hope it was a neutral look. I tried for a neutral look, and I said, well, how do you feel about not being able to talk to him? But in those moments, I was not prepared. I was not expecting that. And all I did was like, well, how do you feel about that? And I let her continue to talk to me while I'm in my head just spinning of how do I make this okay that she still loves her brother and she still misses her brother even if he was her perpetrator. Like, how do I keep going? And she talked herself through it of just, I miss him and I love him and I wish I could see him and talk to him, but it's okay. And then she went off on a tangent about something else.
At all. She was just talking, like telling you what day of the week it is.
Yes, she was fine with it, but internally I was distressed because then I had to continue just having the conversation. So is that what you do? Is you just listen to them and then you go where they take you? Because I know she's been having acting out behaviors in the cottage. around that, I mean, of course, I came right up to the office when I was done and talked to Alexis and let Alexis know what was going on. But is that the right way? Is there a right way? Help?
Well,
because I mean, when I say she said it like saying the sky is blue, the grass is green, she said it just like the sky is blue and the grass is green. Today's my brother's birthday, and he's the one that had sex with me.
thoughts, anybody?
I probably would have done the same thing Neva done, was just went.
Yeah. Just would have been there just to listen.
Yeah, like, how do you feel?
But I think the value in that is that she casually brought it up with you.
Because
Which
I had
normalizes
a conversation with her that morning. It's in her behalf, but she was telling me how excited she was because it was her brother's birthday. And knowing what we know, I just had that neutral face, and I was like, okay, we're gonna have to stop this conversation real quick, real fast, in a hurry, because
it could go south.
It could go south, yes. Yeah. And then like she came out, so I sent her back to her room. I said, oh, that's cool, like. And then she was like, yeah, I wish I could talk to him, but I know I can't. But it's okay. Okay, finished that conversation. She went to her room, got ready, and then she came to me at the table saying, I mean, I can't see my brother today, so I dressed like him. Like, oh, okay, that's cool, sweetie. Like, that's fine. Like, that you're celebrating him, and he's not able to be here. Still think like you're still thinking of him. And then she went on to eat her cereal, and that was it. Because I couldn't.
But that's okay, because I wasn't prepared for it, because it just came out of nowhere. I mean, like, we were talking about where she was in her progressive, and she said she genuinely doesn't think she's ready. And I was like, do you know what genuinely means? And we talked about that, and then all of a sudden it was that, and just like a 2x4 couldn't have hit me any harder than that.
I think here's the value in it. You all normalized the conversation. You've informed Alexis. When Alexis then asks her, tell me about your brother's birthday, they get into the healing part of the trauma. Because you all normalized it, to me, that's just as important as what happens with Alexis, because it's the avenue towards healing.
And in talking to Shanika last night, apparently she's talking more and more openly about those parts of her trauma. Has she talked to you yet? Because you're her person.
Nope, I can't. At changeover, we talked about. She say stuff, I tell her.
Or she says, go to Miss Haley.
Yeah, I tell her, hey, that's a little bit too much for me right now.
Barbara, this is a young girl who has been open with the staff about feeling stimulated and not knowing what to do with that. And so they have just kind of said, go to your room. You know, not in a punitive way, but those things are private, and that
we take care of private things in our room.
Yeah. I think as far as concerns yesterday, I think yesterday she just wanted somebody to listen. Because she said something to me about it now that you said something about it. She said something yesterday to me, and I didn't really think about it when I said what I said in response, because she was like, yeah, today's my brother's birthday. I said, oh, for real, today's Kenya's birthday, too. I said, ain't that all right? And we moved on.
But it's normal.
Yeah.
And I wasn't thinking all the things.
Yeah, I was thinking, wait, did her brother? I was just normal conversation. What? Today Kenya's birthday too? And then boom, we went on.
I ain't there yet. I ain't gonna lie to y'all.
But that's okay.
Right.
You don't have to be there. Because here's the thing, we're gonna have other kids that you will be there for.
Yeah.
Because you're gonna be there to listen to Jasmine.
Because you're her first time.
So Barbara, what are your thoughts hearing all this? Because these are the kind of conversations that happen every day here among our team. So what are your thoughts?
Well, a couple of things. They never, it's not like they say, okay, I'm going to tell you something that's going to blow your mind. Can you hold on for a second while I tell you this?
Man, if I could get that, that'd be so nice.
But you know what? I heard both of you say that you tried to keep your voice, or you tried to keep your face neutral. And it sounds so simple, but it isn't. And it's a really important thing to do, to try to just say, oh, really? Because you don't know. You can't automatically assume that she is angry with her brother. In fact, it sounds to me like she told 3 people that it was her brother's birthday. So it was obviously on her mind that that part of what she was processing was her brother, not the person that molested her.
Yeah.
And that's always going to be there with family incest. You have a mother first, a father first, a brother first, and then they do something that they shouldn't do. So that's the tricky part of incest. I think you handled it well. I mean, for one thing, you didn't question her a lot. You didn't say, well, tell me, how do you feel about this? You just let her talk. And like Neva said, she kind of talked her way through it. And she got it out. She wanted you to know, and she got it out. And then she went to 2 more of you in the course of the day and said, this is my brother's birthday. You know, kids of incest have all of that normalcy stripped away from them. And obviously she feels conflicted about him, or she wouldn't have been dressing like him. So underreaction is always better than overreaction. And you're always going to have those things that those kids do when you are not prepared for it. And like, who's the easy person in this situation? It's Alexa, because Alexa knows when they come to her office, that's the reason they're there. And she's prepared for that. She knows that this is going to happen. But you're out there on the porch talking to her about whether or not she'd like cauliflower for dinner, and she begins to talk about her brother. So that stuff is going to happen all the time in residential. That's why you guys are so key to all this. Do you think you should have done something different?
No, I mean, I wish I had known it was coming, so I could have been a little more prepared mentally for it, because we went from talking about the fact she hates doing her laundry to that, back to she hates to do her laundry, and how old I am apparently. But you know, you never know if you're doing it right. And I wish there was like the magic wand where you saw like little stars or something above the kid's head, like, you did okay, like 5 out of 10, like something. Yeah, like when you're playing the Sims game, you figure out if you're doing it right. I never know if I'm doing it right. I'm just hopefully optimistic that I haven't messed it up too much.
I don't think you did. It sounds like you did what you needed to do. And, you know, sometimes if you just sit back, which is kind of the thing that therapists need to remember, if you just sit back, they do a lot of the work themselves without you guiding them. They're going to do the work themselves. And if she didn't need to tell 3 of you that it was her brother's birthday, the fact that she told 3 of you would indicate that that was really something on her mind and she wanted to figure out how to process it. What you could have done wrong is said, oh, your brother's a dirtbag. Look what your brother did to you. And it sounds silly, but there are a lot of people who do things like that. And that's what you don't want to do. You don't know how she feels about her brother. You don't know how she feels as time has gone on about her brother. Yeah. Whatever she might have felt 6 months ago, maybe something entirely different now. Or maybe she has a nice memory of her brother having a birthday party before all this happened. So what you did was let her come to the table, and they never do it when you're prepared for it.
It makes you so nervous when you go to the cottage some days, because you're like, what's gonna happen today? What am I gonna run up on today?
Well, and you've got all girls, and girls are much more likely to verbally process that stuff than boys.
Regurgitate it?
Yeah. So I shared with Barbara yesterday, I don't know what it was about last week's training that got me to thinking about our kids sexualized eating bananas. And our approach has been just to take bananas out of the cottage. One of the things that I've thought about over the week is that is definitely an approach we can take, but we lose the opportunity to teach how to appropriately eat bananas. Barbara, can you talk more about Mahogany says we get the bananas and cut them up for them, but there again, you still lose the opportunity to teach that there's just some things you don't do with a banana when you're...
I'm just okay with that today. I'm just okay with not having to teach how to eat a banana. I'm just okay with it.
Yeah, Micah and I talked about that yesterday afternoon. The thing of it is, you guys are so used to dealing with children with abnormal behaviors, but that sometimes it's like everything they do seems abnormal to you. But kids have been making stupid comments about bananas since God was a boy. I mean, it's like a 5th grade thing to make dumb comments about bananas. So yeah, put the bananas back in there and teach how to use the banana.
Neva brought up a good point last night. We were talking about this. I said, Barbara's response is that's what 5th graders do, but these aren't our 5th graders doing it.
These are our girls getting sent home for sexual conduct at school that's, oral sex on male partners at school. Like, this is not like, they're not just pretending to eat a banana in an inappropriate way. They're following that up with those sexual behaviors at school. Like, it's not just that we're going to pretend like we're having oral sex with a banana or a carrot or a cucumber or ice cream lollies, ice lollies, or a pickle or they're actually doing those behaviors as well. So all we're doing is teaching all the time about this is not the appropriate thing to do. And, I'm just tired of teaching about bananas.
Well, you can either take all those foods out of the cottages, and then you won't have your teaching moments. This is where it just gets icky after a while.
And Neva says, okay, that's option 1. We'll take it.
We'll take it. We've left all those other things in, and we've done all the teachings. But you know what? Sometimes I just want to be at my house and be able to eat a banana and not think about any of the rest of the things. And that's not always possible. Just cut it up. Is it really what you have to do now?
Yeah, just eat it.
We can put the bananas back and have teaching moments. I'm just going to get mentally prepared for it. It'll be fine.
I think that's your key. You have to get mentally prepared for it. And you guys, you have to remember that these kids have had such hypersexualized behaviors. But really, 5th graders do make fun of bananas. So, but this is not the 5th grader that's going to go off and have oral sex with the coach. So, but it is not in the world of normal.
It was. Yeah, the one that she accused her. She shot her. Yeah. He is also Dulce's science teacher every day. Wait a minute. But because he didn't do anything, she lied.
What's his name?
What's going on is that one of the girls actually made an allegation against one of the coaches at the school. And so
she was giving him fellatio.
Yeah. And so I think the
room just realized.
Yeah, the room just realized that what starts with a banana progresses to that kind of, they see everything and everybody as sexual related to them in some way.
Yes.
Whether it's behaviors, allegations, just verbal talk, that kind of stuff.
Well, it certainly sounds like you have tons of opportunities for re-education. And if you don't do it, who's going to do it? You are it, and you're with them all the time. So you can either take all of these foods out of the cottage and teach them how to use them, or
if we don't teach them, who will?
We're teaching them about the 25 other times a day. This one thing is the hill I have chosen to die on. Let my bananas just be sacred. We will put the bananas back in the cottage. I will digress on that, and we will put those back in the cottage. But
maybe we should start cutting them up and then start.
But that's what I was doing. Well, that's when I got boys. I would cut them up for snacks because when I know for everybody to get a hold of them, I would cut them up.
Corrected. That's what
it's now.
But it already was corrected.
It's now.
Okay. Let's see if you can earn. We're going to try it again. You can earn back bananas if you can eat them appropriately, because you all know what appropriate banana eating looks like, children. ladies.
But it would be a corrective with any of the other stuff too.
It is a corrective, and you know how much
They
they
did it
care
with
about a
State Plan,
corrective? Not at all. It's been SC for a couple of them because it's just every time
So
you
you don't
turn
know the
around,
time.
it.
Okay.
It's on the airplane.
Tell Sam to put back on the list. Tell your friend Sam to put it back on the list. Tell her to put those important on the
Wait,
list.
because I got a couple other things that need to go on the list.
No, they're not, because that's because of the cottage.
We're like 10 minutes over Barbara's time.
Sorry, we've made decisions about bananas. They're going back in the cottage. Fine. Fine, I'll just get my own therapist. It's fine. Gonna go to my own therapist and be like, I hate bananas. And I flies and pickles.
You do realize that what you do with each other is group therapy. And if you didn't do it with each other, you would not survive in this field because you have something that you need. You have humor and you can get through a lot of stuff with humor. You really can.
Well, we're gonna be fine if we've got humor. We're gonna.
Tequila.
It goes on all hours of the day and night, Barbara, you know?
You know, I mean, hey.
But you do realize this does not happen in every cottage. This does not happen in every group that I've worked with. What I see with you guys is that you can laugh about it and say, God, I just don't think I can stomach looking at another banana. And that's what you have to do. You have to be able to support each other. And if you think that this is the norm, it isn't. There are a lot of groups that I have worked with that do not work together the way you guys do. And that's what's going to get you through. We can't stop and correct all of the awful things that have happened to these kids that make them behave the way they do around food. But you can keep going in this work by what you're doing right now, which really is to support each other. And if you do that by making silly 5th grade jokes, then do that. What difference does it make? At least you can get up at the end of the day and go home.
Except for Micah, she lives here.
I know. I know. Besides the bananas and the food and anything else, is there anything else that you guys wanted to talk about before we close
Are there
down?
any of our other kids
Like
seriously that have exhibited? Landon was kind of an extreme situation. What we have now, the only other one that came to mind, Barbara, is our 11-year-old that physically has tried to kiss the staff or just invade their boundaries. And I think that across the board, our staff are like, no, stop, that's not appropriate in addressing it.
But then we have our principal of the school going right behind that.
Yeah, but she's not being sexual with that. It's a boundary, it's boundaries with this.
But I think that could grow. Well, I mean,
It could progress that way.
yeah, I think
Yeah, I
it's
agree.
because she doesn't know how to make the determination.
No, I think that boundary, she think that it's okay, and she feel like, well, who?
And she falls she falls in love with them.
Yeah.
I feel like we're dealing with that now concerning the case.
Emotional and physical attachment. Like she thinks you should automatically want to let her kiss you.
Yeah.
But so that's where Alexis has to be with her, is in the boundary part of, you don't, you know, an 11-year-old doesn't refer to a case manager as their wife, you know, or you don't
have to
kiss your staff.
keep them boundaries with
right.
her.
It's hard too.
Well, remember when we were doing the Michael Jackson thing, and Michael Jackson told those 5-year-olds that he loved them and they loved him? So what you're talking about is setting appropriate boundaries, that 5-year-olds don't fall in love with 30-year-olds and 10-year-olds don't fall in love with principals. But again, it always comes back to re-education with you guys.
Would she admit that she was infatuated with Lauren?
Yes.
She did.
She's like, I'm gonna marry her.
Yeah. Really? I didn't know if
she's
it's
like,
been
she's
that.
Gonna be my wife. She
when I
said
turned
it
up
to
8.
Lauren.
And Lauren just doesn't say anything back.
She's like, she doesn't say anything, or she says Elijah, and then they move on to something else. But she never says Elijah. That is not appropriate. We are not going to do that. But what Sean said is really important, and I think needs to be said in this group setting, is
we are working so hard to reinforce those boundaries. She goes to school every day and she's not getting any boundaries because she's smart and she's a leader and she's this. And the principal handed her car keys and let her walk way down the road to get in her car.
I mean, when the principal allows her to do this to her, and doesn't say a word, there's issues.
And so we're the ones saying boundaries, 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 and they're not. And I've had that conversation with the principal myself on 2 occasions, one on the phone and one in person. And she's like, no, Elijah's just an angel.
Yeah.
She's such a good leader. But that's not how everybody at that school views it. That's only how she views it. And she's making Elijah a monster at school, and then she comes home and she's
a monster.
She runs her behavior. She thinks she runs the show here too because she runs it at school.
So what we've got to do then is align with the people at school that view her as a monster and have.
And they love her, and they like Missy French loves her, but she's like, I'm not putting up with her crap.
Yeah.
And that's the thing.
They say she touchy-feely there too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The kids on the playground, the staff,
Mr. Christmas views her as a monster. Well, not necessarily like a monster, but like doesn't put up with
none of her stuff.
Yeah.
He puts up with none of it because when I said that Elijah uses swear words Elijah would never used to do that. Oh no! And Mr. Christmas was like, yeah, she does. She cuts his kids out on the playground all the time.
Mr. Lewis was
Christmas.
Well, that's what he was with.
Yeah.
Haley. It's Mr. Lewis.
So have that conversation with you, wanted to solve that problem.
Oh, I didn't offer a solution. I offered an interaction.
What's going to happen though is Elijah, when that starts, those boundaries happen, she's going to nut up, and they're going to have to be prepared to deal with that.
Yeah.
And not.
My 2 cents in my pocket.
You don't think they're going to?
You can buy a piece of gum. It's okay.
Yolanda's not going to set the boundaries.
She ain't set them at the middle school.
She didn't, exactly. She did not set, she's never set the boundaries.
She sure did.
Wherever
she
sees,
was
she's
mean
never
as
set the boundaries.
She just didn't like my baby. That's all that was wrong.
She let Davita do it. She the one who learned.
And whisper.
I was going to kangaroo punch her. About Kamani.
Did you say kangaroo punch?
Yeah.
So we'll continue to address that, Barbara. I think it really is just emotional, physical, all the kind of boundaries.
Yeah. And you can't control other systems. You can't control what happens at school. It sounds like there's certain portions of that school that are probably going to try to bring this kid in line, and then other parts of that school that aren't. You just can't control that. You can control what happens when they get home, and continue to try to reinforce what you're doing.
But we can control her being the visiting resource and all that with one of our kids. When we have 2 kids that go to that school, it shows the other kid that she's playing favorites.
Yeah. Yep.
And we can take a role in that. So. Well,
thank you, Barbara.
Thank you for this. This has been very helpful.
Well, you guys have been great, and I have really enjoyed. I told Mike I really enjoyed working with you, but I'm not just saying this. You guys work very well together, and we have certainly seen. I have certainly worked with groups that do not work well together, don't agree with each other. Even like on the Enterprise campus, those changeovers could be painful because you have 2 sets of house parents that are diametrically, philosophically opposed to each other. So they get a week of one, and then they get a week of the next one, and that is not helpful. So you should just keep continuing what you're doing.
Well,
I think you are doing a great job. So, but Micah, do you need anything else from me in terms of what we were going to do? If you need certificates or whatever you need.
No, we're good. We have been filling out sign-in sheets and evaluations. Do you need those back for your records?
I would love them.
Okay, we'll do that, and then I'll probably have a follow-up conversation with you because you really sparked a lot in terms of the clinical part today that I think we could grow in or I can grow in various areas. So we'll be in touch about next steps.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of your day.
Bye.